Welcome to Baruch College. Welcome to the Big Countdown 2010. I am very pleased to welcome this truly distinguished group of panelists, many of whom I know for a very long time and have been dedicated to numbers and population numbers for a long time. Let me briefly just introduce the panel, including the moderator, say a couple of words and get right into it. I'm Doug Musio. I'm the co-director of the Center for Innovation and Leadership in Government here at Baruch College, along with Barbara Fife, and I want to thank Barbara and Brian for their work in putting this together. I want to thank the panelists for agreeing to participate, and I certainly want to thank Sam Roberts for moderating this panel. Sam is the Urban Affairs correspondent for the New York Times. Prior to that, he was the City Hall bureau chief, and he's one of these folks in New York City who is really concerned with numbers and what these numbers, these important numbers, mean, particularly the census. When I did a quick Google of articles just for my own background, lots of the articles that came up were Sam's articles, and I used them in my teaching. So we're honored to have Sam here. To my immediate left is one of the city's civic treasures, Joe Salvo, who's the director of the Population Division at the New York City Department of City Planning, who knows more about the demography of the city than any living human being. And he will tell you what trains to ride, where to eat, what to see. Talk to Joe. To Sam's, left is Seema Agnani. She's the founder and executive director of the Chaya CDC, a community-based organization in Jackson Heights, which looks at housing and community issues. And clearly the census is of extreme importance to varieties of communities in New York City, as well as the city itself as an entity. Angelo Falcone is a character, but besides being a character, he's the president of the National Institute for Latino Policy, and he's been involved in this stuff for at least a couple of decades. We're not going to go much further than that, but 3 or 4 decades, really. So it's a pretty long time. Excuse me. And there's Tony Farthing, who has been the director of the U.S. Census Bureau's New York Regional Office since 1996. He knows the city. He knows the census. He knows our needs. The guest that we're missing is Stacy Cumberbatch, who is the New York City Census Coordinator, a new position that was created by Mayor Bloomberg in January 2009, and I'm really looking forward to her being here because she is truly a vivacious character. So I turn it over to Sam.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Barbara, and thanks all of you for coming today. City officials say that we are on track to hit a record population of about 8.4 million when the census questionnaires are all counted. You wouldn't know that, of course, from the early returns. The deadline is less than a week away. There's still tracts, as of yesterday at least, in which no one had returned their questionnaire, and a lot of tracts around the city that have a return rate still in single digits. Now, counting the population is not just an abstract kind of thing. All residents of the United States are supposed to be counted. It's constitutionally mandated every 10 years so that Congress and state legislatures could be reapportioned on the basis of one person, one vote. The figures are also used in the distribution of billions of dollars of federal aid, some $25 billion annually in New York City, according to the mayor's office, also to do things like implement anti-discrimination laws. Now, let me start off by asking how many of you have filled out and sent in your forms? Whoa, what a good group. Tony, there you go. This is good here. In my coverage, as Doug pointed out, numbers are just a starting point, just to prove that even demographers have a sense of humor. Someone once pointed out to me that at the rate that Hasidic Jews are reproducing in Brooklyn and Mormons are reproducing in Utah, they're both going to meet somewhere in Indiana by the middle of the century. We know that isn't actually true, of course. But the census is really about people, and that's a very important thing to remember. And what this city is all about, the census provides the backbone for figuring all of that out and the diversity that makes this city unique. I remember I did a story when the Census Bureau said the population of the city was going to hit of the United States was going to hit 300 million people. And I called a friend of mine at the Health and Hospitals Corporation and said, find me a baby who's going to be born at that precise moment. So sure enough, the person did, Elmhurst Hospital in Queens. The baby was Emmanuel Plata. He was the son of Mexican immigrants. The doctor who delivered him was from Argentina. One of the nurses was from Russia. Another was from India. And the anesthesiologist was from Bulgaria. Now, if that isn't what New York City is all about, I don't know what is. And to me, the most finely calibrated test of political power in this city and the best indication of how well immigrants have assimilated is how many days you can persuade the city council to suspend alternate side parking on. Well, newer immigrants have been so successful at assimilating that regardless of your heritage, you don't have to move your car on, in addition to all the national Christian, Jewish holidays, the Hindu Festival of Lights, the Asian Lunar New Year, and 6 Muslim holy days. The United States and New York have changed a lot just since 2000 when the last decennial census was taken. Today we're verging on 309 million people nationwide. According to the census, every 7 seconds another American is born, every 11 seconds one dies. Each 37 seconds there's a net gain of 1 immigrant, which means every 13 seconds the nation's population clock records another person. So let me start off, and the rules here are, there aren't any rules. I'm just going to ask some questions, and with luck, all our panel members will jump in and respond. Stacy, welcome to you. And we'll try to leave some room at the end of about an hour and 15 minutes for questions from the audience, if you have any. Tony, you said when I interviewed you a couple of weeks ago that you were hoping for a 70% male response rate in the census. Do you still think so? And why is it going so slowly, at least at this point, with a week left?
I'm still optimistic about 70%. We're doing a lot of things that we've never done before in any census, and some of them include the monies available for paid advertising. We've never advertised in 28 different languages. New York City's offered us a wonderful opportunity to get all of those languages into the media because we have it. And so that's been tremendous in itself. And the contractors have done things on radio, television, newspapers, whatever best fits that particular ethnicity, because they all don't receive their information the same way. So we've done some good information, background information on that. I'm also optimistic. I've had just about triple, if not quadruple, the staff, what I would call my soldiers on the ground that I hire. And their job is to get out into the communities. We've been, again, very careful about making sure that we have a face that fits the community. And their job, and they've been doing this since the beginning of May, going out to all the communities, being involved in all of the ethnic festivals, going door to door to reach particular organizations that provide service to the communities. We need those individuals actually to be the spokespersons for the census because they can talk about why this is important, especially if they've used census figures to get grants for the services they provide. So those things make me very optimistic only because we've done more on the ground and types of activities to reach the public. I want to emphasize, though, 2 things, because I think you mentioned something earlier, Sam. The deadline really for filling out the form and mailing it back is April 15th. That's the day that we're guaranteeing everyone that if you mail it back by the 15th, then we won't have to have someone come knocking at your door later. Remember, we do the census in 2 parts. We're now in the phase where we allow the public to freely respond. The second part of it, which begins in May, is when we send an army of people out knocking on doors for the households that did not respond. So we're trying to be very optimistic. We got a lot of help. I'm going to toot a lot of horns here. A lot of folks at this table, they've done this before, and the mayor's office has been very supportive. A lot of it starts with Joe finding these addresses for us, but we got Stacy out there pounding the pavement with her team. I have Angelo doing a lot of work for us. He's tackling some great things for us in terms of the filling out the questionnaire, because a lot of people seem to be stumped with the race and ethnicity question, especially our Latino community. So we have him doing those things, among other things. We have a service provider who's really the person who can say, you got to do this because I can't do what I do for you if you don't do this, because this is maybe where I get some of my resources. So I'm still very optimistic. I want to add one more thing, that the census usually gets a bump in response like you wouldn't believe after the 1st of April, and that's kind of been historic. One of the reasons we think a lot of people are holding on to their forms because the form says who's living in your house as of April 1st. So we know that that's an issue that we have to kind of realize and recognize. A lot of folks just aren't going to fill the form out right away. But you mentioned New York. We're also a very difficult place to do counting. West Virginia, well, not West Virginia, but Wyoming and South Dakota, those states have just about a 30% rate right now in returns. But I would argue, the states are small. When they come home, what are they going to do? Well, there's a census form sitting on the table. We have a much tougher job here in New York. We have the longest commuting times in the country. We're very, very busy people. Many of the very neighborhoods where we're asking, and we see the low response, a lot of these folks have more than one job just to survive. So there are challenges here that you don't see in other places, but I still have to remain optimistic that by April 15th, that we would get to that point. And we're going to do a lot of things. There's a lot of things we're going to do, a lot of rah-rah, getting out in the neighborhoods. We have great tools that maybe we talked about later. We never had a website where we could go in and follow daily which census tracts are not doing well.
So when we do that, and you could go online, I'm not sure the exact website, but you can do it online and follow it by census tract and see what the return rate is. We couldn't do that before, but is there any sense how much better or worse we're doing in some of those tracts in 2000 compared to now?
This is, I think, the early week to try to determine that. What we have seen in the places that you would expect a greater return, not so much in New York City, but I would tell you Rockland County and Westchester and Suffolk and Nassau. And I need to include Staten Island. Staten Island has, sometimes they have some characteristics similar of Westchester County more than Brooklyn, and they followed true to form. So it looks like for those particular types of communities and characteristics, we are getting that bump that I was very surprised. In fact, the bump is almost ahead of the national average. It's just our city, a very difficult and very diverse and wonderful city that we're very concerned about. And we're going to just have to do more work to get people to do stuff. I'm looking forward to this weekend, actually, because maybe, that Sunday is the day people sit down and fill the form out because they're not working 3 jobs. So.
Stacy and Angelo in particular, could you tell us what you are doing and how you're connecting with various groups? What you're doing, Stacy, is totally different than was done before on the city level. There was never an official full-time census coordinator. How do you get people involved, and how have you been doing it for months and months?
So really briefly, the mayor created the office NYC 2010 Census last year, April 1st, a year before the actual official census day. April 1st is Census Day. It's a reference date in the Constitution. And the office is basically charged with leveraging our city resources to ensure an accurate count. So that means a number of things. First and foremost, using our city resources like 311 as a point of information for people. It's been up and operating for a year, giving basic information about the census, along with a website translated into 18 languages with basic information. Now the site has obviously been revamped because we're in the mix of getting people to fill out the form. So providing information like the participation rate map, you can click on through our site to see how different areas or neighborhoods are doing in New York City. There are language hotlines on that site, as well as through 311 to get a form in 4 or 5 other languages, as well as a language guide in 59 other languages to assist people in filling out the form. So just trying to make sure that we're using all our city resources to ease access into this complicated process in many respects. The other thing is working with our city agencies. So Department of Education, for example, launched a census in the schools curriculum that actually the Census Bureau contracted with Scholastics to develop. And we launched that through a big announcement. There are 1.1 million children in the public school system. A letter went home with all of those children last week, a backpack letter encouraging parents and guardians, explaining about the importance of the census and encouraging them to fill out the form immediately and mail it back. But the concept behind the census in the schools curriculum, which many of our schools are implementing, is to teach about civic participation and what this process means, both in terms of democracy, inclusion. It has maps for mapping, social studies, all the things. It's a very rich area in which to teach children, and then they go home and they tell, mom and dad about, or grandpa and grandma about what the census is and did we fill out the form for our family and how it's confidential. The other thing that we were doing early on was reaching out to a lot of community-based groups here around the city, mostly umbrella groups like New York Immigration Coalition, like the New York Community Media Alliance, to try to see how we could work together and collaborate. These are organizations, among many, like Chaya, who are on the ground, working with a large variety of diverse immigrant groups throughout the city. So they have, their ground troops and they have their ear on the ground. So we can provide in the city a supportive atmosphere, but at the end of the day, it's their hard work that is a trusted voice for people to feel comfortable about this process. So working with these groups, we've sponsored a couple of ethnic and community press briefings, worked with some of the private philanthropies here in the city to make sure that funds could be available to fund some of the extra work that these groups are doing to do outreach in those communities. So it's all of that kind of work, working with Joe's office to really get the maps, to understand how did the city do in 2000? Where were there hard-to-count communities? Where were the response rates low? Trying to really understand that so, we could target. Now, the whole city needs to be targeted in many respects because, we're a diverse city, and Joe will probably go through some of the demographics. And so it's not like it's necessarily, there are certain places where you got to focus more, but it's not like there's any one place. It's the whole city, frankly. And so working with everyone to push that information out. You can imagine in the past week, we've been very busy, and as you said, the response rates on Wednesday, for example, were lagging, but overnight they doubled. Okay, so I was surprised.
The map is how up to date?
It's at 4 o'clock every day.
It's supposed to be 4 o'clock. No, I'm angry.
They
When
didn't
I
do it.
left,
They didn't
when
do
I
it
left,
today.
they didn't do it today.
That's why I'm
so,
late. I was looking for the results for today.
Yeah, I copied everything down and I said, "This is the
So,
same as
so the fact that they doubled overnight, and this is, I'll rely on Tony from his past experience saying that this week is usually a slow week and you'll start seeing a bump. The fact that it doubled overnight, that was good. That means that it's an upward trend. So the real push, there has to be some urgency. So, when we say April 1st, it's not due April 1st, it's due April 15th. April 1st is the reference date in the Constitution for the count.
Tony just gave me more time to procrastinate.
Well, and that's
Talk
part
to
of
him
it.
later.
People. I've talked to people. They know I'm doing the census. Did you fill out your form? And they didn't fill it out yet. And I'm like incredulous. How could you not? Well, we have time. We have until April 15th, or I'll get to it this weekend. So there's a lot of that.
I promise I will get to it this weekend. I promise. Let me ask Seema and Angelo, when you're out in the communities and trying to encourage people, and have been for months, to fill out the forms, what's the biggest challenge? What are people concerned about, afraid of? Why don't they just say, well, of course I'm going to fill it out, but we need to be counted for any number of reasons?
Right. Well, I think it's a whole variety of issues. I will say last week, we've been door knocking for the last few weeks, and last week a lot of people hadn't received the form yet, so I think that probably has something to do with it as well. Others are throwing away the form because it's addressed to resident, and so they don't think to keep it. But I think when people say they're hesitant to complete it, there are a number of reasons. There are a lot of immigrants living in these neighborhoods. We work particularly with South Asian immigrants, so they're from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And you can understand why somebody of Muslim heritage would be afraid to fill out a form, in a post 9/11 era.
Most of those would be legal immigrants, but still, as
Yeah.
Muslims, would be concerned.
Yeah, because we have a history of profiling in this country, a recent history, and so that's a legitimate fear I think people have. Also, just not understanding what it actually means, I think, is a big part of it. A lot of these people come from countries where census occurs, but not all, and so I think just understanding why it's important is a big part of it. But getting the form itself is an issue, and we've talked about the basement apartments in the neighborhoods that Chaya works in, which is Jackson Heights, as well as Jamaica, so southwestern Queens as well as northwestern. A lot of them are single-family homes. They have basement apartments, first-floor apartments, and Joe did his best to get all those new addresses in. But I mean, there definitely are. We found that about 40% of the homes in these communities have these units, and not all of them will get forms, or they'll get one form that goes to the owner. So that's a concern too.
They'll go into the mailbox even though, with one form addressed to resident, even though there may be 3 or 4 or more households living at that address.
Right.
Angela?
Well, I mean, part of the problem you still have, even with all the advertising, there's still a lot of people that don't know what the census is.
Yeah.
And they don't even know what's going on. That's one thing that's always kind of frustrating, because a lot of us, we go to these, we live census and, everything's census, and then I can't believe somebody doesn't know what the hell it is. So that's one issue. The other issue is just also personal information that people just don't want to share. I mean, we talk about the specific situations of immigrants, people who are here undocumented, but then, regular people, right? People who don't have those things. I don't know if I want to give all this information to the federal government, especially with what's going on in Washington.
Yeah.
All this crazy stuff. Now you have people, the Tea Party guys firebombing, congressmen's houses. No, it seems that way, by the news. But I think that has an effect as well. And sometimes the message you're trying to get out are positive messages. This is going to help your community. You participate. It's going to bring more resources from the federal government into your communities. It's going to affect reapportionment. Your representation, redistrict. And I also like to tell people that in the Latino community, I go, look, there are a lot of people they don't want you to fill out the damn form. They want us to all go away, go back to Mexico or wherever, So don't give them the satisfaction. Fill out the form just to bust their chops. That's my theme. So, there are different ways, I think, of trying to get a message across. But there are people who are really are fearful about how the information is going to be used. Last, I think 2 weeks ago, the Justice Department came out finally and said, look, one issue that always came up, does the Patriot Act trump the confidentiality rules that you have at the census to protect the information? Finally, the Justice Department about a week and a half ago said no, it doesn't trump it. So those are the kind of messages we're trying to get out to folks to say, look, this stuff is is safe. You can participate, but again, it's an ongoing battle in terms of getting people's confidence. But once people don't fill out the form, then he sends people to your house.
If you can talk a moment, Tony, about the confidentiality of it. People fill out the form, they may say, why do they want my phone number? What do they want all these other things, even though it's a shorter form? How confidential is it? Is it shared with anyone, and can anyone ever see it?
The person that works for the Census Bureau that does share it is going to jail, first of all, for 5 years. Secondly, they're going to have to pay a whole lot of money, up to $250,000 in fines. All of us who work for the Census Bureau, we understand that. We have to take it's a life-binding oath of office. All of our census takers that work for us, the oath is the same. It's a life-binding oath, so we cannot give that information out. I've always, Sam, tried to tell folks, I'd ask you now, if you're going to say this isn't safe and all these things are going to happen, and I usually challenge individuals to say, well, I want you to then come back to me and tell me where all of the things you're saying that's going to happen, because I've been doing it for 3 decades now, and I know that as a manager doing this for 3 decades, this has not happened. I did this even a decade before in a different capacity. It did not happen. We didn't share information. We do have issues where folks want to go back and look way back in history during World War II and things like that happened. But everybody needs to realize that Title 13 of the U.S. Code was really enacted and enforced after World War II. So that gave everybody even additional and greater protection from the federal government that this information was going to be protected. So it's confidential for 72 years. And everybody has to realize that if you participate in this, there's greater value than you could ever believe. And the same folks that don't want to do this, especially our immigrant community, they don't even realize that they can use it to their advantage when they're trying to apply for citizenship. That's their proof of being here. for not only them and their child. You know, I'm probably not supposed to say this so much. We don't want to advertise the census that way. But there's, you know, we're in New York, so let's really talk the facts here. And they need to hear that and understand it. This is a tool that they can use to help them for whatever may happen at some point when they might want to become citizens here.
I didn't realize that. They can actually ask for the census form and say that, yes, they
Their
will.
own information, and it's tightly, and I can't tell you how tightly monitored this is, where you have to show proof that you're asking for yourself only.
For all the rest of us, we have to wait till 2082, right, to look at the form?
No, anybody
Not for your
can.
individual.
Yeah,
They can
yeah,
look
we
at it.
do
Right.
things for age search. We have an age search department and everything else. But it is a very tough sell to the immigrant community. You know, I appreciate what Seaman and Angel have said, because there are a lot of folks that don't understand. But I think over time, and if you look at some of the things we're doing, what Stacy talked about, the census in the schools, we spoke with the mayor the other day, and I think we talked to the children, said, you know, children, we don't want to have this discussion with you in 2020. We're educating about the importance of it now, but sometimes it's good to let the children look and see, you know, through the time. I hope that the Census Bureau allow us to have programs, because we still have to educate throughout the decade. This is what happens. You know, Angelo knows this quite well, and Joe, I know you know, that you have to tell folks and show people this is. Not only that, you go to the website. This is what your data looks like. Your name's not on it. Nobody's gonna find you. Secondly, as the decade rolls on, folks have to understand what is happening through the decade because of what they did in the census. So there's a lot of education. Some of it we tried to do last time. You know, we can't. You know, we got to get the census done very good and right for our neighborhoods, so that we can talk about that. But it is a tough sell, Sam, and it's I don't think that you know, even in 2020, I think we're still going to have to fight this, because every decade you get more immigrants coming into the country who don't know about the census. So you're always going to have to educate.
Doug Muzio called Joe Salvo one of our city's great resources. He is that for sure. He ought to be working for America's Most Wanted, because he's probably found more people than any other person in the country. Joe, tell us what you've done to prepare for the census and how.
Okay. The important thing to realize, as kind of an adjunct to what's been said here, is that it's important to be counted, but in order to be counted, you have to be placed at an address. You have to be attached to a piece of turf. Because for reapportionment, redistricting, all the constitutional uses of the census, you have to be in a place. That place has to be recognized by the Census Bureau. The story that Sam worked on a few weeks ago about the building on West 42nd Street is a good illustration. The building was not initially recognized as a legitimate address by the Census Bureau. We work with the Census Bureau in close cooperation with Tony and his staff to make sure that that building's address was recognized. Once it was recognized, the returns that go in with that address will be counted. If you submit a form with an address that is not recognized, you're not counted, in effect. The address has to be legitimate. So that means that the base of addresses for the census is really the foundation of the count. And it is the basis for everything that gets done. And when I tell people that it's very important, it's not only that you be counted, but to make sure, you know, that, for example, if you fill out a be counted form, that you write in that address clearly, and you make sure, we have to make sure that address is on the list. So the bottom line is that we worked for 3 years in preparation for this census to make sure that the Census Bureau's address list for New York City was the best that it could be. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that as a result of a piece of legislation that was passed in 1994, Tony and the Census Bureau in Washington is allowed to give us the address list for the mail-out. Now, we have to sign an oath of confidentiality. We cannot use that address list for any, the purpose other than the census. And we get that list, and we then go ahead and we examine it over a period of time. And we have the ability to correct it, to add to it, to delete from it. And that's what we did for a few years. We worked on it. And I can tell you today, that there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.45 million, 3,450,000 addresses in the city of New York, okay? That number of addresses, even taking into account increases in the vacancy rate for the city, even taking into account shifts in average household size, is more than enough to support our population estimate of 8,400,000 for New York City. In fact, as you probably saw the other day in the New York Times, the new population estimate for July 1, 2009 is 8,391,000. We are on target for a enumeration of 8.4 million. There's enough housing units to support that estimate. Now, the question is, how do you go about getting people counted? Now, I understand the mail response rate is extremely important. History has shown us, and the research at the Census Bureau has shown us, that communities that have low mail response rates tend, in the end, to be undercounted. Okay? That's very important. But right now, the Census Bureau has a daunting task. If the mail response rates in communities of the city remain low, in the areas that have been low, and they remain low, it means that Tony's job is going to be twice as tough. And there's only so much you can do. If you only get 1/3 of the questionnaires back and you have to pursue 2/3 of the household, it's not only outrageously expensive. Tony, I believe the estimate is that if you enumerate by mail, it's 40-something cents, right? Right. If you enumerate in person, it's $59.
Yeah.
Every 1 percentage point decline in the national mail response rate costs the census, costs us $90 million because of follow-up. Follow-up is very expensive, it's very intense, and it can be a problem. But in the end, what I can tell you is that there are enough housing units to support our population estimate, and we really feel that this is the count we should get.
And how many more did you find that weren't on the census list?
The Census Bureau's list, when all is said and done, we added 127,000 housing units to the list. Most of those were basements, attics, extra apartments in 1, 2, and 3 family houses. We did it with a combination of records from our finance department, our buildings department, all kinds of records that we have access to. And that allowed us to add these addresses. Now, if you multiply that times average household size, you end up with about 300,000 people. If you multiply that times Stacy's or the Brookings Institution estimate for the average amount of money that each response is worth to the city, it comes to $3,000 per person per year. It ends up being somewhere in the neighborhood of $900 million a year in the city's budget. Just think about what we can do with an extra $900 million in the schools and for services in the city. So that's why we're all here. This is very serious, and we want to make sure that we give Tony every chance we conceivably can give him in order to make sure that the federal government does right by us in the city.
Tony and Stacy in particular, if people don't send back their forms, do they get a second chance? What happens next?
And this is the first time you're doing it, right? I'm going to say something.
The second mailing?
Yeah.
No, this is the second time.
So the
but
Census
it's
Bureau
bigger.
is going to mail a second form starting Monday to census tracts or communities within New York City that are considered hard to count or were low response rate areas in 2000. So a lot of the areas that Chaya, for example, is working in, all the areas that Chaya is working in, will get a second form next week. So the hope is that getting a second form will prompt those that didn't fill out their form yet,
Don't
right?
point
Like
at
Sam,
me.
right? Or may have thrown that form out that was addressed to resident, right? It's in recycle by now to fill it out. So that's a huge thing to happen, and we're hoping that will increase. We'll get a bump in the response rate next week.
And then if they still don't respond?
If they still don't respond after April 15th,
Right.
we use that as a reference point, kind of as a deadline, synonymous with, going to the post office with your taxes. There is a grace period. We know stuff comes in late. We have a grace period of about a week just to see what late returns come in. And at that point, we kind of chop the cord, and that's when I unleash the massive army of enumerators to go out. We start training the last week of April, and by the 1st of May, we'll start deploying the waves of enumerators. And maybe I'll head off a couple questions in the past here, but our enumerators, the way we've recruited, and we've always done that, we recruit locally, even down to the census tract level. So when we send out our wave of enumerators, for SEMA's neighborhood, for example, Jackson Heights, we've recruited so that we can get Bengali speakers, so we can get the Urdu speakers and
We've
folks.
met all of them.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Nice.
So you probably helped us. So,
Yeah.
and that's the whole intent, to try to get individuals so that when they go out and knock on the door, that we do it one time and one time only. Joe, can I add something to you? What you said. You said it's $59 per person. That's a national figure. So I want to really raise the bar here for New York. We're allowed to go up. We're allowed to go up to 6, make up to 6 visits. It's smart for us to spread them out, not do it like all 6 visits in 1 week because people aren't around and all kinds of things. But we have to make a lot of visits. And I want to keep harping on this thing that, New Yorkers, we have long commuting times and we work late. We have many jobs. So my point has always been to everybody that, mail the form out, fill the form out and mail it back, because when we start coming out to knock on the door, there's never a good time. There never is a good time. And if you look at everyone's schedules, especially SEMA, where you are in our Latino communities, Saturday isn't even a good day.
Yeah.
I mean, so you just have Sunday, and then they're not home. People aren't home on Sunday. They come home late, whatever they're doing. There's never a good time. So we have to really enforce it, folks, that whatever ounce of time you have, and it doesn't take that long.
So if you don't want Tony showing up at your house, you better fill out the census form. The census defines hard to count by, I think, about 12 variables. Immigrants, non-English speakers, single parents, poorer people, renters, which we obviously have a lot of in the city. But one phenomenon that took place last time around, particularly in Southeast Queens, was there was a low response rate in spite of the fact that that community didn't meet those criteria. Why would that be, and how are you addressing that this time?
Well, we've talked about, there's a lot of theories behind that, right? We don't know. We do know a lot of immigrants have moved into Southeast Queens from the Caribbean, increasingly, in the past 10 years. That's one thing. We also know that one of the things we talked about was the single-family home, where there's a basement or an attic being rented, which is pretty common in Southeast Queens as well. And that...
And perhaps rented illegally.
Right, that's what I mean. Rented, something subdivided, an illegal 3-family, it's really a 1-family. And preceding the 2000 census was the first time that the City of New York, in Joe's office, was able to do that review of the address list and update it. So for the first time, many units that would ordinarily have been on that list that were that illegal basement or attic were added. So that could have been a reason why people had a lower response rate. So let's say it was a 1-family and they're expecting 1 form. They got 3 forms, 1 to the basement apartment, 1 to the attic, and an owner would say, well, how do they know I have an attic or a basement? So all of those things are things that we think could have contributed to that low response rate, but not totally, because we do see, and Joe did maps for us going back to 1990, that it was also a low response rate in 1990. So that was before this update to the address list and before a large influx of immigrants into those communities. So who knows what all
And
the
it could be
factors-
a racial
There's definitely,
element to
right,
this.
all of
And-
the areas in New York City that have had historically a low response rate are of the African diaspora.
And the
So-
other thing that I think New York confounds it, because, the Census Bureau came out with this nice hard-to-count
Right.
index, and then all this maps and all this stuff. And then it doesn't really work that well in New York. For example, the other
Southeast
place.
Queens.
Well, I'm thinking of not Southeast Queens. I'm thinking
Northeast
about
Bronx.
Yeah, I'm talking about also the Washington Heights, for example,
Right.
which has all
Right.
the characteristics where, according to the index, nobody should have returned their forms, and it had one of the highest response rates in the city.
If not the nation.
Yeah.
Why would that be?
It's I can tell you, it's Dominican pride. More than anything else.
right.
More
No,
than
it's
anything
true.
else.
It's true, yeah.
One of the things that I would tell you is that in working with all the organizations, there's certain groups in New York City and even in the metropolitan area that they defy the odds, even though they're immigrants and everything else. The Korean community, the Russian community. You'd be surprised at the level of response, the level of involvement, and then our Dominican community. For some reason, there's something, if even, I've seen folks that actually go up and do interviews with people in the street in Washington Heights, and they know about the census. You go into other Dominican communities, they know about the census. They know about the importance of it. There's a sense of pride with that.
Well, I think there's an organization, Alianza Dominicana,
Oh, yeah.
that
Yeah,
did
Mr.
a
Perez.
lot of organizing work, and they really deserve
Well, it just
credit
goes
for
to
that.
show, it goes to show that it's very exciting, the idea that despite all these demographics that supposedly work against participation, it's possible to organize and overcome them. And I think that's very encouraging. So,
Angela, what about people, particularly in the Hispanic community, who are organizing against filling out the census forms? Where does the motivation for that come from?
well, there's a minister out in New Jersey who started a movement last year to boycott the census. And the idea was to have undocumented Latinos boycott the census as a strategy to put pressure on the Obama administration to support comprehensive immigration reform.
Sounds a
and-
little convoluted.
Yeah, well, it is if you see the press releases. I mean, you really have to be spiritual and have a lot of faith in it because the logic isn't quite there. I've debated him a couple of times, but it's something new in the Latino community. We never had in the Latino community. The census is almost like a religious thing. You know, people really see it as so important to the community that we always get everybody rallying around it. So now we have this boycott, and it also was a weird combination because you have this minister who's very socially conservative, very interested, and his intentions are good in the sense of, you know, wanting to see comprehensive immigration reform. So that's not a problem. It's just the tactic that doesn't make sense. And then he had another guy, Nativo Lopez, who's on the West Coast, who's an immigration advocate. It was like a Marxist Leninist. It's like the weirdest combination, you know. Basically, over time, I think what's happened is that message has gotten diluted, and that it's lost a lot of steam. Although he's still out there putting out the press releases. But
One of the things that I guess makes New York even more unique is the diversity of even the immigrant population. So are there, I mean, this is fascinating to me that there are groups within the immigrant population, and certainly the Hispanic community is if it was once predominantly Puerto Rican, it is now much, much more diverse. The black community as well, at least in terms of foreign-born and American-born. There are groups within all of these communities that are much more likely to participate and some that aren't.
Well, they're fighting. There were groups in the African American and the black community, let me put it that way, that are trying to make sure that Caribbean blacks, for example, how do you fill out the form in a way that you can make sure that the Caribbean black community is understood. In the Latino community, there are a lot of folks, Dominicans, Salvadorians, who are real pissed at the fact that there aren't boxes in the Hispanic question for them, and have actually gotten people like Congressman Rangel to push legislation to add a box. So there's a lot of that stuff. There are people, for example, at NYU, there's a group of Afro-Latino Forum that's trying to encourage Afro-Latinos to check off black. And that gets interesting because, by the way, you know, the Hispanic question kind of trumps the race question. So if you put that you're Hispanic and black, you're counted by the Census Bureau as Hispanic. So it's really been interesting how creative people have gotten in terms of
Why do we need to know whether people are black, white, Hispanic, Asian, or anything else?
Can I comment? You know, I mean, a similar issue is happening in the Indo-Caribbean community. A lot of those immigrants from the Caribbean of Indian origin, this organization is encouraging them to complete the form as Caribbean, and they'll default to black that way. And so there are some issues going on within that community. But, you know, for us, there's a lot at stake with the census because, you know, there's not a lot of data that disaggregates among the Asian American community and Pacific Islander community. And so most of the research that you see that's put out on the national level, you know, sort of subdivides everything African American, Latino, and white, and Asian is left out entirely. And New York is so much more complex than that, as we all know.
And the categories are so complex. I mean, New York City, most of us, I don't think, would realize, has more American Indians than any other city in the country. It's not the kind of thing you would normally associate with New York City. But how many of them are people from India who are now American?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I have no idea. I think most people are filling out Asian Indian if they are of Indian origin, but, you know.
Tony, can you explain why no one is getting the long form this year, that everyone is getting a 10-question form that presumably is much easier to fill out, and that the Census Bureau says takes less time to fill out than to boil a hard-boiled egg,
Okay.
among other things?
Well, since the mid to late 90s, we've been doing a survey called the American Community Survey. And it is basically the prototype of a census long form. We do that survey every month of the year. The samples, it's a sample survey now. The sample size was small, and then it's been increasing and increasing and increasing. And we've increased it throughout this decade so that we feel that by 2011, we'll be able to have data that we can get, for the most part, that we feel is very good data, down to, for cities at the level of 25,000. And that's the reason why we're no longer doing the long form. Now, keep in mind, too, that the Census Bureau always recognized that the long form was an impediment to our getting census participation and people mailing the form back. And you do have to look at it. In 2000 and before, we were mailing the long form out to 1 out of every 6 households. So half the meetings I would go to would be, and letters I would get, during this crazy month of March in the year 0, where we're getting complaints that why did my neighbor get the short form and why did I get the long form? I'm not going to fill all these questions out. It's just all those kind of things. So if you're very cognizant of the world of statistics, I think it was an ingenious idea really to come up with a way to get this data that we can use. And somebody like Joe with the American Community Survey, we have releases now that come out just about every year, and aggregates of data that come out, and that's great stuff for any city to use to plan instead of waiting every 10 years to get some information. He gets some real-time data throughout the decade.
That's a great segue to my next question, and this could be off the record, Joe, but what do you think you're going to find in the 2010 census that we will learn about New York?
Wow. Jeez.
No, tell us.
What?
Tell us.
I'll pull out my crystal ball.
He knows.
What we're going to see is a city that has become, from all accounts that we do, all the statistical estimation that we do, we're going to see a city that is going to become increasingly Hispanic, a city which will become increasingly Asian. Those are fast-growing groups, and I don't do justice with that generalization, though. What we're going to see within the Latino community is the increased presence of the Dominican population, and some people might be surprised, but actually probably as much because of births as through direct immigration. We're going to see a big increase in the Mexican population. We're going to see diversification within the Hispanic community, which is unprecedented. We already know right now in New York that about half the population speaks a language other than English, and about half of that population speaks Spanish. There'll probably be upwards at least of 2.5 million Spanish speakers in New York. What'll happen within the Asian community is that the Chinese population's always been between 40 and 50% of the Asian total. It'll probably be the same because of what's happened with immigration. But we're going to see a South Asian presence that is just going to increase and blossom. Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. Let me say something about the effect that this all has on our outlook. When you go through the neighborhoods of New York, what you realize very quickly is that the immigrants who come here, and again, I'm admittedly, I've drank the Kool-Aid a long time ago. The fact of the matter is that New York immigrants are really special. And some people might ask, why is that the case? Well, those immigrant groups that I just mentioned live side by side with other groups in a way that you don't see in many cities throughout the world. Or if you do see it, there's hostility. So one of the things that's really interesting is that there's this kind of gentleman's agreement that exists when you move to New York that you may not love the guy next door, but you're going to tolerate him. Why? Because you're here for the same reason. Now, I'm hoping, praying, that this transmits into the census process, that this feeling, that this tolerance moves into this operation, which will last the next few months, to the point where people will say, yeah, you know, I'm part of New York now, and I want to fill out my form. I want to make sure Astoria gets the number it needs. I want to make sure Jackson Heights, Flatbush, all the communities of the city, Williamsbridge in the Bronx, gets what it needs. So that's kind of what you hope takes hold here. And our increased diversification is testimony to the fact we have groups living side by side right now. I mean, you mentioned earlier, the Orthodox populations in central Brooklyn are living side by side with the South Asian and Caribbean communities. And you have Orthodox Jewish communities living side by side with Muslim communities in ways that maybe you have to go to Jerusalem for this. I don't know. One of my
Well, Jerusalem, though, they're fighting with each other.
well, one of my favorite guys, Bob Kaplan from the Jewish Community Relations Council, always says that Jerusalem's like the only other place where we can see this. There are very few places in the world where you see this. And the hope is that somehow communities will coalesce and people will say, yeah, I want to stand up for who I am. And that's what this whole operation's really about. And my goodness, I hope 8.4 million people decide to do that, because that's what we deserve. One other thing, if I may, something people don't think about. The American Community Survey runs continuously. Right now, if you go to the Department of City Planning website, you can get a 2008 update on the population of New York City from the ACS. What groups are here, all kinds of attributes, characteristics of the population. And that's really cool. We do that every year. But what you may not know is that the sample from that survey is directly linked to the census enumeration. It means that if the census enumeration is bad in a neighborhood, that neighborhood could suffer for 10 years, because the sample will never really be what it should be for that neighborhood, because the enumeration, the address list and the enumeration came up short. So when they go to pull the sample, that may be an issue. So I want you to think about it that way. It actually has a rippling effect throughout the decade.
How many people do you think, or what percent of the people in the city do you think we just don't count, that we miss for one reason or another, even with the best of efforts and intentions?
Well, undercount is a net concept, and that gets to be confusing. Like if I tell you in 2000, there was really almost no net undercount in the city of New York, by all estimates. In 1990, there was a net undercount of 244,000, but in 2000, there was almost no net undercount. I would be deceiving you. Why? Because there were whole communities in New York City, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Central Harlem, the Northeast Bronx, Southeast Queens, that were under-enumerated. Probably to the tune, in the single digits, 5, 6, 7% overall, but among males, 20 to 64, probably 15% missing, okay, in those communities. And then there were other communities where people voted early and often. Where the addresses were a problem, where there was duplication, and they counted that effort. So what that means is that redistricting is affected. That maybe those communities I mentioned earlier are not getting the representation they deserve, and maybe those other communities are getting more than they deserve. So it's a lot more to it than just an overall number.
One of the issues that has come up, and too late probably to address this year, is where do you count prisoners? And do you count them upstate where Republican legislators want them because they provide jobs, or do you count them in the places where they came from and are likely to return to and give representation to those communities?
Yeah, well, you know, the Census Bureau was a meeting with black leaders that they had. The director had Al Sharpton, and talk about New York being represented nationally, Al Sharpton. And they raised that issue, and the Census Bureau for a long time was saying, look, we can't get involved with that. We'll give you the counts of group quarters of prisons, but we can't get into allocating people back to where they came from originally. But what they did is, I think there was a compromise, and they said, look, well, we'll be able to provide the states with this information at an earlier date, and you guys can figure out what you want to do. So in New York State, there's a bill, Schneiderman and somebody, there's a bill to try to say that New York can go into the prisons and collect information on where the person resided before they went to prison, and then it's up to the state to figure out how they want to allocate that person. it's an ongoing kind of issue. There are some people, in our communities that say, look, there are a lot of our folks are being underrepresented in terms of, they're up in prisons in upstate New York someplace, and then those communities are getting the benefits of the numbers and we're not. But it's a really contentious issue. I don't think it's been fully debated. I'm interested to see what happens to this bill. But it's something that I think finally the Census Bureau, just like the thing with same-sex marriages, the Census Bureau was saying, look, we're not going to designate these same-sex marriages. Got a lot of pressure and finally made some changes. So the census is a political animal, and there are all these groups that are trying to get representation, and the census becomes very central. You asked earlier, what's the purpose of this thing? And in a lot of people, it's not just an emotional thing, it has very practical consequences. So, of course, if prisoners are allocated to where they came from, that would have some impact on redistricting, reapportionment.
And in fact, you're going to make some of this information available next spring in a way that...
A little earlier.
Yeah, a little early. But Sam, I want to make a point, though, that what Angela said is correct, but the Census Bureau still has to do the census count the way we've been doing it all along, meaning that we're going to go in and do the count of prisoners where they're residing. And then what Angelo is saying is that once we have done that part of it, which we have to do by law, there's nothing on the books that says we can change that. And keep in mind, too, everybody thinks, well, the Census Bureau needs to do this, the Census Bureau needs to do that. A lot of what we do, a lot of what is on that form, a lot of what is in our procedures, it comes from two sources. It's the Office of Management and Budget in Washington and also our Congress. And they're the ones that really dictate to the Census Bureau what they're allowed to do. So it's not like the Bureau can just come off and make wholesale changes on things. And there's some things that are on the books as law. So as Angelo said, when we did get some of the changes by law, the real big one too was with the LGBT community, to be able to not just count people, but it's about putting out the statistic
Right.
as they've been counted, and that's the issue. So in this census,
In same-sex partnerships.
well, yeah. So in this
Right,
census,
right.
for the first time, we'll actually put out data saying that if you put down your same-sex partner or if you're a same-sex spouse, we'll actually put out that information. We weren't allowed to do that before.
Let me
Stacy?
just say, and it's important to know that the mayor came out early supporting the reporting out of same-sex couples, and he and Christine Quinn, the speaker, wrote a letter to the Commerce Secretary at the time back in April of last year saying, report out this information, because it's just about reporting statistics. So if people put down that they're in a same-sex relationship, the Census Bureau should report it out. Similarly, the bill that's pending in the state Senate, Senator Schneiderman and its Assemblyman Hakeem Jeffries, trying to count back the prisoners at the addresses from when they came, the mayor supported that as well, because obviously it has a disproportionate impact on New York City as opposed to other places in the state. Most of our folks from New York City are incarcerated upstate. It's not that people upstate are incarcerated in New York City. So,
What can the people in this room do to help?
oh, wow. Well, I know everybody raised their hand about filling out the form and mailing it back. That's the first thing, Sam, like today. And then the second thing is that all of you live in an apartment building, you attend maybe a faith-based institution, you're at your job, whatever your sphere of influence is, you then become the ambassador to find out and say to folks, did you fill out your form and mail it back? It's that simple. It's that kind of exponential, but that's that kind of one-on-one communication in a relationship with somebody. So there are things and groups that are out there having relationships with people that they know already. So you cultivate your existing relationships to talk to people about why this is important, why you did it so quickly, and why they need to do it today, and how simple it is, and why it's so important. And some of the things that Joe talked about, the great diversity of the city. And, we're not going to have, if we don't have an accurate count of who lives here, then we don't know about the diversity of the city. That's the only way we know this. We know this information because there's a census and there's an American Community Survey. Otherwise, we would not know the complexity of the diversity. We would not know where new groups are settling and what the needs are for all kinds of services if we don't have this information. So foremost, that's what you can do. Right.
Any last words? Thank you all for coming.
Last words to Sam, fill out your form.
I will.